3 mud-spattered trucks rumbled down the winding dirt road toward Whispering Pines Farm in Montana's Blackfoot Valley, their engines growling with menace as they approached the weather-beaten fence line. Rebecca "Becky" Callahan stood on her front porch, the morning sun glinting off the silver strands in her auburn hair as she watched the vehicles approach through narrowed eyes. Her grandfather's vintage Winchester rifle remained hidden but accessible, propped against the wall just inside the doorway where it had stood guard for the past 18 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At Becky's feet, Maverick, her loyal black and silver German shepherd, let out a low warning growl. She placed a steadying hand on his head, though her own muscles had tensed with the instinctive awareness that came from years of competitive shooting and military training. Her mind automatically calculated distances, angles, and potential cover positions, habits that hadn't faded in the 7 years since she'd left her position as one of the Army's top marksmanship instructors to run this farm with her late husband. Daniel. The lead truck's window rolled down, revealing a face she recognized from local warnings. Jackson "Jackknife" Reynolds, leader of the Blackfoot Posse, a gang that had been terrorizing small farms across 3 counties. His scarred face twisted into what might have been meant as a smile as he surveyed her property, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. Becky kept her expression neutral, though her mind was already mapping firing lines and cataloging details. The man in the passenger seat of the lead truck, whom locals called Twitch Miller, had a poorly concealed sawed-off shotgun across his lap. The muscular figure who emerged from the second truck, known as Butch Donovan, moved with the telltale swagger of someone relying too heavily on the pistol visible under his leather jacket. More importantly, she noted the fresh burn marks on their hands and the distinct smell of accelerant on their clothes. They weren't just here to intimidate. The wind whispered through the pine trees behind the house, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and early autumn. Becky had always loved this valley, its rugged beauty and honest people, but in the past year, since Daniel's death, something had changed. Small farms were being bought out under suspicious circumstances, equipment failures, mysterious fires, property damage, all followed by generous offers from shell companies that seemed to appear overnight. "Mrs. Callahan," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying an edge that made the crisp morning air seem colder. "County Commissioner Roberts sends his regards. Says you missed last month's agricultural board meeting. He's concerned about your commitment to local interests." Becky's hand remained steady on Maverick's head, though her mind was already calculating the distance to her rifle. 20 years of competitive shooting had taught her patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment. The posse hadn't chosen this farm by accident. They'd been watching, testing, looking for weakness. They saw what they wanted to see, a widow struggling to maintain her husband's legacy, not the woman who'd once held the national record for long-distance rifle shooting and trained elite military units. "Been busy with the harvest," Becky replied, evenly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had once commanded training ranges. "Tell Roberts I appreciate his concern." Reynolds stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. "That's not good enough, Mrs. Callahan. Things are changing in Blackfoot Valley. The commissioner wants to ensure all local farms are properly protected." His gaze lingered on the aging barn, the peeling paint of the farmhouse, especially those being run by someone on their own. The threat wasn't subtle. Becky had seen the pattern emerging across the valley, small farms pushed to sell their lands, mysteriously consolidated under corporate names that all traced back to the same shell company. The local sheriff seemed curiously uninterested in investigating. "I managed just fine," Becky said, her voice carrying the same steady calm she'd used to train countless shooters. The commissioner should focus on actual governance instead of running errands for thugs. The farmyard went silent. Reynolds's fake smile vanished, replaced by something uglier. "What did you just say to me?" Twitch slid out of the truck, shotgun now openly held, while Butch moved to flank his boss. Becky didn't move, didn't give any outward sign of the tactical calculations running through her mind. The old grain silo offered the best cover, and she knew every inch of this land, every angle, every shadow. "I said," Becky spoke softly but clearly, "that the commissioner should do his job." Reynolds tried to close the distance, but Maverick's deepening growl stopped him short. The German shepherd's training was evident, not attacking, not threatening, but presenting a clear tactical barrier. Becky hadn't spent years working with military K9 units without learning how to use a dog's presence to control a situation. "Lady, you have no idea who you're dealing with," Reynolds snarled. Becky's smile was cold, but didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, I do. Jackson Reynolds, 3 warrants in Idaho, wanted for questioning in Wyoming. The Blackfoot posse has been running protection rackets across the state, but lately you've moved up to bigger operations. Those burn marks on Butch's hands aren't from honest farm work. You're running something through the old Morrisville processing plant." The color drained from Reynolds' face. Butch's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Becky's stance shifted slightly, and Maverick's growl kicked up a notch. They were starting to realize this wasn't going according to plan. "Here's what happens next," she continued, her voice carrying the same steady calm she'd used to talk shooters through their first competition. "You and your friends leave. We forget this happened, or we find out just how well a former Army marksmanship champion and her trained K9 can defend their property. Your choice." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching rain from the mountains. Then Reynolds raised his hands in apparent surrender, though his eyes had turned calculating. "All right, we're leaving," he said, backing toward his truck. "But this isn't over." "It can be," Becky replied, maintaining her position as the posse mounted up. "That's entirely up to you." As the trucks roared away in a cloud of dust, Becky's mind was already racing through scenarios. She just painted a target on her back. But if her instincts were right, the burn marks on their hands and the processing plant connection pointed to something much bigger. The posse would be just muscle for a larger operation. Becky scratched, Maverick behind the ears, the familiar gesture calming them both. "Good boy," she whispered. The German shepherd had been her constant companion since she'd retired from the army, a reminder of her days training military units. The thought of Daniel sent a familiar ache through her chest. He'd known about her shooting career, had even accompanied her to competitions, but he'd never fully understood the other side of her life, the tactical training she'd provided to special forces, the skills that went far beyond simply hitting a target. A familiar truck appeared on the horizon, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew the territory. Becky recognized Frank Thompson's old Chevy, the retired sheriff who'd become her closest neighbor and ally since Daniel's death. The weathered man got out, his expression grim as he leaned against his truck's hood. "Saw the posse heading out," he said. "Figured I should check on you." "I'm fine," Becky replied, but her tactical mind was already processing new information. "Frank, what do you know about the Morrisville processing plant?" Thompson's expression darkened. "Used to be straight as an arrow when old Jim Morrisville ran it. Since his nephew took over and got cozy with the commissioner's office, things have changed. Lots of activity at odd hours, paperwork that doesn't quite add up." Becky nodded, pieces falling into place. The missing cattle from the Peterson and Martinez ranches had disappeared right after they'd refused to sell. The local sheriff had found nothing, of course. Her phone buzzed with a message from a number she hadn't seen in years. Satellite imagery shows suspicious activity at Morrisville processing plant. Multiple organized crime connections. Support available if needed. Lancaster, the pieces were falling into place. The posse wasn't just working for corrupt local officials, they were muscle for an organized crime syndicate using the processing plant to move stolen livestock across state lines. The accidents at local farms, the pressure to sell, it was all part of a larger operation. "I need to know everything about that processing plant," Becky said. "Entry points, security, staff movements." Thompson studied her for a long moment, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're not just Daniel's widow, are you?" Becky met his gaze steadily. "Let's just say I've dealt with operations like this before, but I need to understand what we're up against. Your daughter still works in administration at the plant, doesn't she?" The old sheriff nodded slowly, the familiar law enforcement instincts showing through. "Ellie's been documenting everything she can. The posse handles their muscle work, but there's something bigger going on. Professional buyers, high-end stock disappearing into unmarked trailers at midnight. She's tracked shipments heading north into Canada, south into Idaho. I need her intel," Becky replied, her mind already formulating plans. Security at the processing plant would be substantial, but she'd breached better protected facilities during her days training tactical units. More importantly, she understood how organizations like this operated. They'd be expecting resistance from law enforcement, not a precision shooter who knew how to disappear into the landscape. Her phone buzzed again. Lancaster's satellite data showed increased activity at the processing plant. Multiple vehicles arriving, professional security patterns. They were preparing for something significant. "They'll come after you now," Thompson warned, his voice carrying the weight of decades in law enforcement. "Once they realize you're a threat, they'll send professionals." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot
to us.
Now back to the story. Becky checked her rifles with practiced efficiency, Maverick alert at her side. "Good, let them come. But first we need to talk to someone who sees everything that moves through that plant. The posse might keep their secrets from law enforcement, but they talk freely around the office staff." Thompson's eyes widened. "Nancy Morrisville, Jim's daughter, still runs the books even after her cousin took over. Been there 30 years. "Then let's pay Nancy a visit," Becky said, already moving toward her truck. The familiar weight of her competition rifle in its case was reassuring. She sent a brief response to Lancaster. "Stand by. Recon only. Blackfoot Valley is about to get interesting." The Morrisville processing plant occupied the outskirts of Cedar Creek, its weathered buildings casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Becky positioned her truck with a clear view of both exits, noting the security cameras, these ones functional, covering the main entrance. Thompson parked his Chevy in the shadows, while Maverick maintained silent watchfulness from the back seat. "Only person who makes it better is my mother, God rest her soul," Nancy replied. "Used to be simpler times." "Heard things are changing around here," Becky said casually, accepting the coffee. Nancy's voice dropped as the posse members gathered their papers. One brushed deliberately close to Becky as they left, attempting intimidation. She didn't bother turning around. Once their motorcycles roared away, Nancy's demeanor changed completely. "Frank called ahead," she said quietly. "Said you might have questions about our recent changes." Becky sipped her coffee. "It was excellent. Tell me about the night operations." 3 months ago, my cousin Patrick partnered with some new investors. Now we're moving stock at all hours. Expensive trailers, professional handlers, the kind of security you'd expect from moving gold bars, not cattle. Nancy's hands trembled slightly. "Last month, I recognized one of the horses, Peterson's prize. Stallion, the one that supposedly died in that mysterious barn fire." Thompson joined them, his deputy reserve badge now visible. "How deep does it go, Nancy?" "Deep enough that Patrick won't let me near the main records anymore, but I've been keeping my own books." She pulled out a thumb drive. They're moving livestock from ranches across 5 states, using our reputation to launder stolen animals through legitimate auctions. The posse provides security, handles any problems that arise. Becky's phone vibrated. Lancaster's message was brief but telling. Satellite confirms major transport operations. Professional security rotation pattern matches organized crime livestock theft ring operating out of Canada. They're moving products south. They're using the old cattle trails, Nancy continued, the ones that run through national forest land. Perfect for moving stock without detection. Patrick has some of the Forest Service in his pocket. They look the other way. The commissioner? Becky asked, though she already knew the answer. Roberts has been dirty for years, Thompson spat. Ever since his brother got involved with the posse. Now half the county government is either on the payroll or too scared to act. Nancy placed another file on the desk. 2 days ago, I overheard Patrick on the phone. Something big's coming. They're clearing the auction schedule, posting extra security, mentioned someone called the director arriving to inspect the operation. Becky went still. The director, a name she'd heard during her time training federal tactical units, a major player in international livestock theft, known for making examples of anyone who interfered with operations. His reputation had been one of the reasons she'd left the army for what she'd hoped would be a quieter life. When? She asked quietly. 3 days. They're having a big auction that night, mandatory attendance for all major ranches in the valley. Perfect cover while they move, whatever they don't want seen, Becky murmured. Suddenly, Thompson's radio crackled to life. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north, professional formation, SUVs and bikes. Becky moved to the window. 4 black SUVs led by Blackfoot posse riders were making their way down the main road. The lead vehicle stopped outside the processing plant. Nancy, does the office still connect to the old storage barn? Becky asked quickly. The older woman smiled, gesturing toward a door behind the filing cabinets. Barn connects to the back pasture. Frank, get Nancy out. I'll draw their attention. Becky checked her sidearm with practiced precision. Maverick, with me. Like old times? Thompson asked, his voice steady despite the tension. Something like that. Becky triggered a small device on her belt, a gift from her army days. Every security camera in the complex went dark simultaneously. The office door chimed as heavy boots entered. Told you this wasn't over, Reynolds' voice carried across the empty room. Boss wants to talk. Becky didn't turn around. Your boss. Could make an appointment. I'm finishing my coffee. More footsteps entered, professional operators by their movement patterns, not typical gang muscle, but private security contractors. This situation was escalating rapidly. Not a request, lady. One of the contractors spoke. Though I've got to admit you've got nerve. Not many people stand up to the posse in their own territory. Becky turned, studying them with cold amusement. This isn't posse territory, not anymore. Blackfoot Valley belongs to its people. You're just parasites who haven't figured out you're dying yet. Take her, Reynolds ordered. Becky smiled. Sometimes the best operation started with letting the enemy think they had the upper hand. As the contractors moved forward, Becky calculated angles, positions, and the exact pressure points that would cause maximum damage with minimal effort. The first contractor never saw the coffee pot coming. Becky launched it in a fluid motion, scalding liquid and ceramic, creating instant chaos as he staggered back. She was already moving, years of competitive shooting having honed her body into a precision instrument. Maverick burst into action beside her, his military K9 training evident in every calculated move. The second contractor reached for his concealed weapon, but found his arm locked in a joint manipulation that sent him crashing into Reynolds. The third made the mistake of telegraphing a wide punch. Becky slipped inside his guard, using his momentum to drive him through a desk. Professional security, she taunted, flowing between them like water. You move like mall cops. 2 more. Contractors burst through the door, these ones openly carrying weapons. Becky dove behind an overturned filing cabinet as bullets splintered wood and shattered coffee mugs. Maverick had already flanked them, his powerful jaws finding one contractor's weapon arm with brutal precision. "You're trapped," Butch called out. "No way out, except through us." Becky pulled a small device from her jacket pocket, another remnant of her military days. "Actually," she replied, "you're the ones who are trapped." She triggered the device. Every light in the office exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. The contractor's tactical lights snapped on, exactly what she'd anticipated. In the dark, they became perfect targets. Moving silently, Becky emerged behind them. The first contractor went down to a precise strike to the brainstem. The second spun, firing wildly, but she was already gone. The third found himself disarmed and unconscious before he registered her presence. Reynolds backed toward the door, drawing a knife. "What the hell are you?" "Someone who's dealt with better criminals than you," Becky replied, her voice seeming to come from everywhere in the darkness. "Tell your boss, the real one, not Roberts, that Blackfoot Valley isn't his playground anymore." "The director will gut you," Reynolds snarled, still trying to locate her in the darkness. "He's handled army types before." "I know." Becky's voice hardened. "I was there." Before Reynolds could respond, she struck with 3 precise hits that left him gasping on the floor. As police sirens wailed in the distance, she retrieved her phone, snapping photos of the contractors' IDs. Lancaster would be able to trace their connections. Thompson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Local police are incoming. Roberts is leading them personally." Becky surveyed the unconscious contractors. "Time to disappear. Meet at fallback. Point Alpha." She whistled softly, and Maverick appeared at her side, both of them slipping into the storage room as Roberts's vehicle screeched into the parking lot. The passage to the barn was narrow but navigable, clearly part of the original ranch's design. Becky moved silently through the darkness, her mind already processing the night's intelligence. The director's impending arrival changed everything. He'd recognize her, know what she was capable of. Her phone vibrated. Lancaster again. "Satellite shows major movement at processing plant. They're accelerating operations. Team standing by." "Not yet," she replied. "Let them think they're in control. I need 8 hours to set the board." The passage emerged in the old barn as promised. Thompson was waiting with his truck engine idling. As they pulled away, Becky could hear Roberts's angry voice. "Find her. I want this whole valley locked down." "Ellie sent this," Thompson said once they were clear, handing her a thumb drive. "Security rotations, delivery schedules, everything she's documented over the past month." Becky plugged the drive into her phone. The operation was even bigger than she'd suspected. The processing plant was just one node in a massive network moving stolen livestock across North America. The director wasn't coming just to deal with her. He was coming to expand the operation. Roberts called an emergency ranchers meeting. Thompson reported as they drove. "They're spooked. Reynolds wasn't supposed to engage directly, especially not with contractors present. They've exposed their hands too early." Becky studied the security schedules. The processing plant's defenses were extensive, but she'd breached better. More importantly, she knew how the director thought, how he'd react. He'd want to make an example of her, just like he had with other threats to his operation. "Frank, I need every detail about this auction. Security, attendance, everything." The old lawman nodded. "They're requiring all major ranchers present, using the main auction arena, single central room, 2 exits. They'll use it as cover while they move something big through the back pastures." Or someone, Becky mused, thinking of the director, of the brutality she'd witnessed during her last encounter with his organization. "Get your trusted friends ready, but quietly. For now, we let Roberts think he's got control of the situation." Becky's eyes hardened as they drove through the darkness. In 3 days, They'd learn why you never bring organized crime operations to a valley protected by a former Army marksmanship champion. The director was coming, bringing his expertise in terror and enforcement, but he'd find more than small-town prey waiting in the Montana night. He'd find a predator who'd learned from past mistakes, one who now hunted criminals with the same precision she'd once used to win shooting competitions. Moving silently, Becky emerged behind them. The first contractor went down to a precise strike to the brainstem. The second spun, firing wildly, but she was already gone. The third found himself disarmed and unconscious before he registered her presence. Reynolds backed toward the door, drawing a knife. "What the hell are you?" "Someone who's dealt with better criminals than you," Becky replied, her voice seeming to come from everywhere in the darkness. "Tell your boss, the real one, not Roberts, that Blackfoot Valley isn't his playground anymore." "The director will gut you," Reynolds snarled, still trying to locate her in the darkness. "He's handled army types before." "I know," Becky's voice hardened. "I was there." Before Reynolds could respond, she struck with 3 precise hits that left him gasping on the floor. As police sirens wailed in the distance, she retrieved her phone, snapping photos of the contractors' IDs. Lancaster would be able to trace their connections. Thompson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Local police are incoming. Roberts is leading them personally." Becky surveyed the unconscious contractors. "Time to disappear. Meet at fallback. In Point Alpha." She whistled softly, and Maverick appeared at her side, both of them slipping into the storage room as Roberts's vehicle screeched into the parking lot. The passage to the barn was narrow but navigable, clearly part of the original rancher's design. Becky moved silently through the darkness, her mind already processing the night's intelligence. The director's impending arrival changed everything. He'd recognize her, know what she was capable of. Her phone vibrated. Lancaster again. "Satellite shows major movement at processing plant. They're accelerating operations. Team standing by." "Not yet," she replied. "Let them think they're in control. I need 8 hours to set the board." The passage emerged in the old barn as promised. Thompson was waiting with his truck engine idling. As they pulled away, Becky could hear Roberts's angry voice. "Find her. I want this whole valley locked down." "Ellie sent this," Thompson said once they were clear, handing her a thumb drive. "Security rotations, delivery schedules, everything she's documented over the past month." Becky plugged the drive into her phone. The operation was even bigger than she'd suspected. The processing plant was just one node in a massive network moving stolen livestock across North America. The director wasn't coming just to deal with her. He was coming to expand the operation. Roberts called an emergency ranchers meeting. Thompson reported as they drove. "They're spooked. Reynolds wasn't supposed to engage directly, especially not with contractors present. They've exposed their hands too early." Becky studied the security schedules. The processing plant's defenses were extensive, but she'd breached better. More importantly, she knew how the director thought, how he'd react. He'd want to make an example of her, just like he had with other threats to his operation. "Frank, I need every detail about this auction. Security, attendance, everything." The old lawman nodded. "They're requiring all major ranchers present, using the main auction arena, single central room, 2 exits. They'll use it as cover while they move something big through the back pastures." Or someone, Becky mused, thinking of the director, of the brutality she'd witnessed during her last encounter with his organization. "Get your trusted friends ready, but quietly. For now, we let Roberts think he's got control of the situation." Becky's eyes hardened as they drove through the darkness. In 3 days, they'd learn why you never bring organized crime operations to a valley protected by a former Army marksmanship champion. The director was coming, bringing his expertise in terror and enforcement, but he'd find more than small-town prey waiting in the Montana night. He'd find a predator who'd learned from past mistakes, one who now hunted criminals with the same precision she'd once used to win shooting competitions. Becky's expression hardened. Not impossible. Challenging, yes. Variables to account for. Wind speed, temperature, bullet drop, Coriolis effect. But I didn't win the National Long Range Championship 3 years running by taking easy shots. She pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket, its pages filled with detailed calculations and topographical notes. I've been documenting every significant position in this valley since the day I moved here. Range cards for multiple elevations, weather pattern notes, seasonal wind variations. Daniel thought I was just being thorough with my practice routines. You were preparing for war, Thompson said quietly. I was preparing for the possibility, Becky corrected. 15 years in competitive shooting taught me one thing. The moment you stop preparing is the moment you lose everything. The truck crested a rise, revealing a small cabin nestled into the mountainside. To casual observers, it would appear to be just another hunting lodge. But as Thompson pulled to a stop, Becky was already moving toward a concealed entrance on the building's northern face. "Welcome to my actual practice range," she said, entering a code into a hidden keypad. The door opened silently, revealing a space that was part armory, part tactical operations center. High-end spotting scopes lined one wall, while custom rifles, each built to her exact specifications, rested in secure racks. "All legal," she added, noting Thompson's expression. "Every weapon registered, every modification documented. I just never advertised my enthusiasm for the sport." A bank of monitors showed feeds from discrete cameras positioned throughout the valley, while weather stations provided real-time data on conditions affecting long-range shooting. This wasn't just a practice facility, it was a command center, designed for precisely the kind of operation they now faced. "The director thinks he's coming to inspect a simple criminal enterprise," Becky said, activating the main computer system. "Instead, he's walking into an ambush 5 years in the making. Every elevation advantage, every concealed position, every escape route. I've mapped them all." She pulled up detailed schematics of the processing plant and surrounding terrain. "But we need to be smart about this. The director's reputation isn't built on empty threats. He'll have contingency plans, professional security teams with serious combat experience. Which is why we strike from where they least expect it," Thompson said, studying the topographical displays. "From distances they consider impossible." Becky nodded, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she compiled data from multiple sources. "Lancaster's satellite intel confirms what we suspected. They're bringing in their elite cleanup crews, men who specialize in making problems disappear. But they're trained for urban warfare, for close-quarters combat. Out here you can reach out and touch them from a mile away," Thompson finished, a grim smile crossing his weathered face. "Exactly," Becky brought up another screen, this one showing wind pattern analysis for the valley. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The director doesn't travel light, and he doesn't take chances. When he arrives, he'll have multiple security layers, escape routes, probably air support." Her phone chimed with an encrypted message from Lancaster. "Director's advanced team includes former Special Forces snipers. They're setting up counter-sniper positions around the processing plant." Becky's smile turned predatory. "Now that's interesting. They're finally thinking about the high ground. But they're still playing by urban rules. In the city, you only need to control certain buildings, certain angles. Out here," she gestured to the surrounding wilderness, "out here there are 1,000 places to take a shot, and they can't watch them all." Thompson studied the tactical displays, his law enforcement experience adding another layer to their planning. "The auction will give them cover for moving significant resources. Local ranchers are required to attend, providing a civilian shield for whatever they're really doing." "Classic misdirection," Becky agreed, "but it also gives us an Opportunity. While everyone's focused on the main event, we can position our assets without drawing attention. Your deputies can... Thompson began. Becky held up a hand, her expression serious. No. The fewer people involved, the better. Your friends can help with evacuation if needed, but the actual operation needs to be surgical. One shooter. Key. Positions. Maximum effect. She turned to a rifle case mounted on the wall, her fingers running along its edges with familiar reverence. Inside lay her pride and joy, a custom-built rifle that had helped her set 3 state records for long distance. Shooting. The director's men will be looking for a tactical response, multiple shooters, coordinated attacks. They won't be expecting one person who can turn this entire valley into a shooting gallery. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades perfecting their craft. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't an army. It's a single expert who knows the terrain and has nothing left to lose. Dawn painted the Blackfoot Peaks in shades of amber as Becky Callahan made her final calculations. Through her spotting scope, she watched the processing plant come to life, noting how the security teams changed their patrol patterns with the rising sun. 4 new guard positions had been established overnight, each manned by professionals, who clearly understood tactical positioning, but they were still focusing on the wrong threats. Range to target? Thompson asked, lying prone beside her on the ridgeline, his own binoculars trained on the facility below. 300 yards to the main. Entrance, Becky replied, making a notation in her range book. Wind at 5 millipers, quartering from the northwest. Temperature 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure steady. She paused, calculating. At this distance, bullet drop is significant, approximately 38 feet. Flight time is roughly 2.6 seconds. The former sheriff whistled softly. That's beyond extreme range for most shooters. Most shooters aren't equipped for it, Becky agreed, gesturing to the custom rifle beside her. Match-grade barrel, carbon fiber stock, advanced ballistic computer. But more importantly, she tapped her range book, 5 years of documented shots from this exact position under every weather condition imaginable. Her phone vibrated with an update from Lancaster. The satellite imagery showed 3 new vehicles arriving at the processing plant, unmarked SUVs with diplomatic plates, a clear sign that the director's advance team was establishing their operational base. They're setting up counter-sniper positions, Thompson observed, noting the movement of equipment to elevated positions around the facility. Becky smiled coldly. All excellent tools in the right environment, but they're calibrated for urban warfare, for shots taken from buildings, at normal engagement distances. Out here, she gestured to the vast landscape, the wind alone will play havoc with their acoustic sensors, and thermal imaging is useless beyond a certain range, especially with the temperature variations in these mountains. The rising sun caught something metallic at the processing plant. A sniper team setting up on the roof. Becky studied them through her scope, analyzing their equipment and positioning. They're good, she admitted. Military training, probably special forces background. But they're defending against what they know, not what they're actually facing. Thompson shifted position, pulling out a tablet displaying the processing plant blueprints his daughter had provided. Ellie confirmed they're converting the main arena for the big event, reinforcing access points, installing additional security measures. But look at this, he pointed to a section of the plans. The old ventilation system runs through the entire complex. They've blocked the main ducts, but the maintenance access points could provide firing lines nobody expects. And more importantly, Becky finished already calculating angles. They'll affect airflow through the building. At extreme range, even small atmospheric variations can make the difference between a hit and a miss. Her phone chimed again. Another message from Lancaster. Director's security detail includes former Delta Force operators. They're bringing in specialized equipment, including anti-sniper acoustic arrays and thermal detection systems. Value estimated at over $5 million. Becky's laugh held no humor. They really don't understand what they're up against. All that technology, all that expensive gear, it's designed to counter military snipers operating under standard conditions. But competitive shooting, she shook her head, that's a different game entirely. We shoot under conditions that would make military trainers blanch. 1,000-yard shots in gusting winds, extreme angle compensation, multiple weather variables. A convoy of trucks appeared on the horizon, moving with military precision toward the processing plant. Becky tracked them through her scope, noting details: armor-plated vehicles, run-flat tires, electronic countermeasure equipment. They're not taking any chances. That's the director's style, Thompson agreed. Overwhelming force, maximum security. In urban environments, it makes him virtually untouchable. But this isn't his environment, Becky replied, making another note in her range book. Look at their vehicle positioning. Standard defensive formation, perfect for city streets. Out here, it just makes them predictable. She pulled out a laptop, bringing up a detailed weather forecast. The day of the auction, we're expecting high pressure moving in from the northwest. Temperature will drop, affecting bullet velocity. Wind patterns will shift. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, inputting data into a ballistic calculator. Most shooters would see these conditions as problematic. For us, they're an advantage. Thompson studied the calculations appearing on the screen. You've been preparing for this kind of scenario specifically, haven't you? All those hours on the range, all those meticulous records. Becky nodded, her expression distant. After Daniel died, I knew they'd eventually come for the farm. The pattern was too clear. Small properties being pressured to sell, mysterious accidents, criminal, organizations moving in. So I started preparing, not just practicing marksmanship, but studying every aspect of this valley, every ridgeline, every weather pattern, every possible shooting position. Her phone displayed another update from Lancaster, this one including thermal images of the processing plant interior. New security systems were being installed, cutting-edge technology designed to detect and prevent any threat, at least any threat they could anticipate. Look at their blind spots, Becky indicated, pointing to areas the new systems couldn't effectively cover. They're thinking in terms of standard engagement distances, normal tactical approaches. Nobody considers the possibility of shots from extreme range, because technically they should be impossible. She opened another case, revealing specialized ammunition. Match-grade rounds, hand-loaded to my exact specifications, each batch tested under varying conditions, performance documented. She held up one round. The bullet itself is designed for extreme range stability. Most people don't realize that at these distances, even the rotation of the earth affects the shot. Thompson's eyebrows rose. The Coriolis effect? At these ranges, it's measurable. Approximately 3 inches of drift at 2,000 yards, Becky confirmed. Not much, but at these distances, every variable matters. That's what separates competitive shooting from military sniping. We account for everything, no matter how small. A helicopter appeared in the distance, approaching the processing plant with deliberate purpose. Becky tracked it through her scope. Private security contractors' aircraft. They're establishing air support, probably equipped with thermal imaging and night vision capabilities. They're creating a fortress, Thompson observed. They're creating a cage, Becky corrected. Every security measure, every defensive position, they're all designed to protect against threats moving in. Nobody's watching for threats already in position. She gestured to their hidden observation post. From here, I can see every approach, every security position, every potential target. More importantly, I can engage from distances their equipment isn't designed to detect. Her phone vibrated with an encrypted message. Final confirmation, director arrives in 48 hours. Full security detail, including electronic warfare capabilities and counter-sniper teams. Ghost unit standing by on your order. Becky studied the message. Then turned to Thompson. We need to accelerate our timeline. The director's bringing in electronic warfare equipment. They'll try to jam communications, disable security systems, and create confusion. We can use that. How? Because they'll be focused on protecting their own communications, their own tactical networks. They won't be watching for older, simpler methods. She pulled out a set of hand signals charts. These were standard for competitive shooting teams. Visual communications that work at extreme range. No electronics, nothing to jam or intercept. Thompson absorbed the information, his law enforcement experience adding another layer to their planning. "And your shooting positions?" "Already prepared," Becky replied, bringing up a topographical map marked with carefully plotted locations. 5 primary positions, each offering different advantages depending on weather conditions. More importantly, each position has multiple escape routes that can't be monitored or blocked. She indicated specific points on the map. These 3 ridgelines provide optimal firing solutions to the processing plant's main entrance. These 2 positions here and here cover the emergency exits and loading docks. From any of these positions, I can effectively control movement throughout the entire facility. Her phone displayed another satellite update from Lancaster. The processing plant was now surrounded by a sophisticated security perimeter, motion sensors, infrared cameras, armed patrols. The director's advance team was leaving nothing to chance. They're following standard counter-sniper protocols, Becky observed, studying the defensive positions. Establishing overlapping fields of fire, securing high ground, implementing electronic surveillance. All excellent procedures for dealing with military threats. But competitive shooting, she shook her head, that's a different discipline entirely. We regularly make shots that military snipers consider practically impossible, under conditions that would ground most tactical operations. Thompson watched as she made another series of calculations in her range book. You're not just planning to defend against them, are you? You're going to dismantle their entire operation, one shot at a time, Becky confirmed, her voice carrying the same steady calm she'd used to win national championships. They think they're preparing for a tactical engagement. Instead, they're walking into a precision shooting exhibition. And they've just given me the perfect stage to demonstrate why competitive marksmanship is in a class of its own. Maverick's ears perked up as a distant vehicle approached their observation post. Becky and Thompson quickly packed their equipment, but relaxed when they recognized Ellie Thompson's distinctive Jeep winding up the mountain road. The younger Thompson emerged from her vehicle carrying a thick folder, her time working at the processing plant having left dark circles under her eyes, but her movements remained sharp, alert. "You need to see this," she said, spreading documents across the hood of her Jeep. "They're bringing in specialized ballistic shields for the director's security detail, rated to stop anything up to .50 caliber, multiple layers of protection including reactive armor." Becky studied the specifications with professional interest. Impressive equipment, designed for urban warfare, close-quarter protection. But out here, she gestured to the vast landscape, at extreme ranges, the angle of impact changes everything. Those shields are rated for direct hits at standard distances. Nobody plans for shots coming in at steep angles from 2,000 yards. Ellie nodded, pulling out more documents. That's not all. They've contracted a private security firm that specializes in VIP protection. These guys have guarded heads of state, operated in war zones. Their counter-sniper protocols are supposedly unbeatable. Thompson studied the security firm's documentation. They're bringing in mobile command centers, electronic warfare suites, even counter-UAV systems, turning the processing plant into a technological fortress. "And that's their weakness," Becky replied, her expression thoughtful. "They're relying on technology, on modern tactical doctrine. But long-range competitive shooting, that's almost a 19th century art form combined with 21st century physics." She opened another case, revealing specialized environmental monitoring equipment. These sensors measure everything: temperature gradients, humidity, barometric pressure changes. In competition, we use this data to make shots that most people consider impossible. The military trains snipers to engage targets at 800 to 1200 yards. Competitive shooters. We regularly compete at ranges beyond 1500 yards. Ellie's eyes widened as she looked through Becky's range book. These calculations. You've been documenting shot conditions for years. Knowledge beats technology, Becky explained, setting up a portable weather station. All their fancy equipment, all their tactical protocols, they're designed to counter known threats. But they've never encountered someone who treats extreme range shooting as an exact science. Her phone displayed new thermal images from Lancaster. The processing plant security teams were conducting rehearsals, running through various threat scenarios. Becky watched their movements with professional interest. Look at their response patterns, she indicated. Standard counter-sniper protocols. If they detect a threat, they'll expect the shooter to relocate immediately. That's military doctrine, shoot and move. But in competition, she smiled coldly, we learn to hold position, to adjust for changing conditions, to make impossible shots repeatedly. They're preparing to chase a ghost, not realizing they're actually facing something far more dangerous, a shooter who doesn't need to move. Thompson pointed to the processing plant blueprints. They've fortified every entrance, every window. The director will be surrounded by layers of security at all times, which means they'll be focused on close protection, Becky noted, making more calculations. Their entire security model is based on controlling the immediate environment. They won't be looking for threats beyond their perceived maximum effective range. She brought up a ballistic calculator on her laptop, inputting data from multiple sources. At extreme ranges, shooting becomes pure mathematics. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, Earth's rotation, even the curvature of the Earth. Everything affects the bullet's path. Most security teams don't even consider these factors because in their world, such shots are theoretical. Ellie laid out more intelligence from the processing plant. They're planning to move something big during the event. Multiple transport vehicles staged at secure locations, specialized handling equipment. Whatever it is, they're treating it like a military-grade shipment. Of course they are, Becky replied, studying the vehicle staging areas through her scope. The auction is just cover for their real operation. They'll use the crowd of legitimate ranchers as camouflage while they move their actual cargo. She made another notation. And they've just given us their timeline, their movement patterns, everything we need. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Lancaster, Director's Security Detail, conducting advanced site survey. They're mapping every building, every sight line within a mile of the target. Becky's laugh held no humor. A mile? They think a mile is beyond effective range. They don't realize they're dealing with someone who sees a mile as a warm-up distance. She turned to the Thompsons, her expression serious. We're going to let them establish their security, let them believe they've created an impenetrable defense. Then we're going to demonstrate why competitive shooting at extreme ranges is the ultimate equalizer. She began breaking down her observation equipment with practiced efficiency. They're bringing in the best security money can buy, the latest technology and proven tactical doctrine. But they're preparing for a type of warfare that doesn't apply out here in these mountains, with these distances. She patted her custom rifle. Pure marksmanship beats tactical doctrine every time. A comfortable silence fell as they packed up. Then Ellie asked the question that had been hanging in the air. How did you end up here, Becky? Frank told me you were some kind of champion shooter, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? Becky's hands stilled on her equipment. For a moment, she seemed to debate how much to reveal. Then she sighed, her expression distant, as she gazed across the valley. I enlisted right out of high school, she began. Scored high on the aptitude tests, got fast-tracked into specialized training. Turned out I had a natural talent for marksmanship, the kind that comes along once in a generation, according to my instructors. By my second year, I was winning inter-service competitions, setting records that still stand today. She carefully placed her spotting scope in its case, her movements precise and methodical, the habits of someone who had spent decades caring for precision equipment. The Army realized I was more valuable as an instructor than as a field operative. I spent 12 years training elite units, developing new techniques for extreme-range shooting. That's where I first crossed paths with the director. Thompson's expression hardened. "You've encountered him before?" Becky nodded, her eyes cold. Back then, he went by a different name. He was running operations that supplied weapons and tactical equipment to anyone with cash, cartels, terrorists, insurgent groups. My team was tasked with tracking his network, specifically his sniper training camps in Eastern Europe. She closed the rifle case with a decisive click. We shut down 3 of his facilities, captured 2 of his top lieutenants. He took it personally, began targeting military marksmanship instructors, my colleagues, my friends. The memory clearly pained her, but she continued, her voice steady. The last operation went bad. We had intel on his main training facility and went in with a joint task force. It was a trap. He'd been feeding us information through a compromised source. 8 good people didn't come home that day. "And you?" Ellie asked quietly. "I was the advanced scout, positioned a mile out, watched it all happen through my scope and couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The facility was hardened, walls too thick for my rifle to penetrate." Becky's jaw tightened. "After that, I was done. Took honorable discharge, started competing professionally, met Daniel at a tournament in Colorado. He was this quiet, gentle man who looked at me and somehow saw past all the darkness. When he talked about his family farm in Montana, it sounded like paradise. Open spaces, long sight lines, a community of good people. When we married, I thought I'd left that other life behind." She turned to face them fully. "Then Daniel died, and suddenly there were strangers in town, making offers on the farm, pressuring me to sell. When I started asking questions, I found connections to shell companies, the same patterns I'd seen before. The director's organization is expanding, establishing new trafficking routes through the northern border. Blackfoot Valley is their new hub, with Roberts and the posse as their local muscle." "Why didn't you just leave?" Ellie asked. "Start over somewhere else?" Becky's expression softened slightly as she looked around at the mountains surrounding them. "This valley became my home. These people became my neighbors. Daniel is buried on that farm. Some things are worth fighting for." Thompson nodded in understanding. "And some enemies need to be faced head-on. There's one more thing you should know," Becky said, her voice taking on a different quality, the professional tone of a tactical briefer. "The director doesn't just traffic in stolen livestock. That's their cover operation. Their real business is weapons, cutting-edge military hardware that falls off trucks during transport, prototype systems that disappear from defense contractors." Ellie's eyes widened. "That's what they're moving through the processing plant. Makes sense," Thompson agreed. "Livestock transport provides perfect cover, sealed trailers, legitimate reasons to cross borders, rural routes that avoid major checkpoints. According to Lancaster's intelligence," Becky continued, "they're moving something significant during this auction, something that requires the director's personal attention. If we can disrupt this operation, document their network, we can hand a complete case to federal authorities. But first, we need to handle the director himself." She turned back to her equipment, checking one last item, a custom rifle with a well-worn stock, its barrel gleaming even in the fading light. Her fingers traced the engraving on the receiver. 2,600 yards, Denver Nationals, May 2018. The rifle that had won her last championship before she retired. "This isn't just about stopping criminals," she said quietly. It's about finishing something that started years ago. The director thinks he's untouchable because he's always surrounded by layers of security, always beyond the reach of conventional forces. Her smile held no warmth as she carefully placed the rifle in its case. But he's never faced someone who specializes in making the impossible shot. Twilight descended over Blackfoot Valley as Becky Callahan made her final adjustments to the hidden observation post on Falcon Ridge. Through her spotting scope, she watched the processing plant transform into a fortress. New security teams moved with military precision, installing equipment that turned the old building into a technological stronghold. But their preparations revealed more than they concealed. Fresh intel from my contacts in local law enforcement, Thompson reported, joining her at the observation point. 6 more vehicles crossed the county line an hour ago. European plates, diplomatic credentials. They're staging at different locations, coordinating their movements. The director's personal security detail, Becky confirmed, studying the new arrivals through her scope. See how they position their vehicles? Counter-ambush formation, advanced protective tactics. These aren't just hired guns, they're elite operators. Her phone lit up with an encrypted file from Lancaster. Satellite imagery revealed a complex network of security measures being implemented around the processing plant. Mobile surveillance units, signal jammers, even counter-sniper. Drones patrolling the perimeter. They're establishing a multi-layered defense, Thompson observed, examining the data. Each team operates independently, but coordinates through a central command structure, military-grade communications, encrypted channels, and every single layer designed to protect against conventional threats, Becky added, making notes in a fresh page of her range book. The leather-bound volume contained years of data, not just shooting records, but detailed analyses of how different atmospheric conditions affected bullet performance at extreme ranges. Ellie spread out new blueprints across their mobile command station. The main arena's been completely retrofitted. Bulletproof glass, reinforced walls, multiple escape routes. They've even installed some kind of electronic countermeasure system in the rafters. Becky's expression remained focused as she studied the modifications. All excellent precautions for close-range protection, but they're still thinking like urban operators. She pointed to specific areas on the blueprints. Look at these sight lines. They've blocked every direct angle of fire, secured all the obvious shooting positions, but at extreme range the geometry changes completely. Her phone displayed another update from Lancaster, Director's advanced team conducting final security sweeps. They're using ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, even seismic sensors to detect any approaching threats. Impressive technology, Thompson commented, watching the teams work through high-powered binoculars. Top-of-the-line equipment, best money can buy. And all of it calibrated for standard engagement distances, Becky replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades mastering their craft. You know what the difference is between military sniping and competitive shooting? Military snipers train to be good enough. Competition shooters? We train until it's mathematically impossible to be better. She opened a specialized case, revealing custom-made ammunition gleaming in the fading light. These rounds were handcrafted for shots beyond 2,000 yards. The bullets are machined to tolerances finer than a human hair, powder charges measured to 1/10 of a grain. In competition, this level of precision is the difference between winning and losing. Out here, she gestured to the vast landscape, it's the difference between impossible and inevitable. Thompson studied the ammunition with professional interest. I've never seen rounds like these before. Because they don't exist anywhere else, Becky explained. Custom design developed through years of competition experience. The military uses standardized ammunition because they need reliability across different weapons and conditions. But for a single shooter with a single rifle, pushing the absolute limits of what's possible, She held up one round. This is what happens when ballistic science meets obsessive perfectionism. Her phone chimed with new intelligence. Lancaster's satellites had detected increased activity at small airfields across 3 states. Private jets landing, helicopters being prepped for flight. The director's bringing in his entire operation, Thompson observed. Not just security, but his whole organization, using the auction as cover to establish a new base of operations. Because he thinks he's invulnerable, Becky replied, making more notations in her range book. His security teams, his technology, his tactical doctrine, it's all proven effective against traditional threats. But they've never faced someone who treats extreme range shooting as an exact science. She brought up historical weather data on her laptop, comparing it with current conditions. Tomorrow's forecast shows a high-pressure system moving in. Temperature will drop, affecting bullet velocity. Wind patterns will shift. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, inputting data into specialized ballistic software. Most shooters would see these conditions as problematic. For us, they're variables to be calculated, understood, exploited. Ellie laid out more intelligence, gathered from her position inside the processing plant. They're requiring all local ranchers to attend tomorrow night's auction. Mandatory participation, no exceptions. But the main cargo, whatever they're really moving, that happens during the event using the crowd as cover. Classic misdirection, Thompson added. Keep everyone focused on the legitimate auction while their real operation proceeds unnoticed. Becky smiled, but it held no warmth. Except they don't realize they've given us exactly what we need. Their timeline, their movement patterns, their security protocols. We need to turn their own plan against them. She opened another case. This one, containing specialized optics. These aren't just scopes, she explained, removing a particularly advanced piece of equipment. They're precision measuring instruments. In competition, we use them to read mirage, the heat waves that show wind conditions between us and the target. Most tactical operators don't even consider mirage at their operating distances. At 2,000 yards, it's as important as wind speed. Her phone displayed new thermal images from Lancaster. The processing plant security teams were conducting their final rehearsals, running through various threat scenarios with military precision. Look at their response patterns, Becky indicated. If they detect a threat, they'll expect multiple shooters, coordinated attacks, standard military doctrine. They're preparing to deal with a tactical team. She shook her head. They don't understand that at extreme ranges, a single skilled shooter can control an entire battlefield. Every shot is a mathematical equation. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, Earth's rotation, even the curvature of the planet. Get the math right, and distance becomes irrelevant. Thompson watched as she made another series of calculations. You're not just planning to disrupt their operation. You're going to dismantle it completely, one shot at a time, Becky confirmed, but her voice held no satisfaction, only the focused determination of someone preparing to execute a carefully calculated plan. They've created what they think is an impenetrable defense, multiple security layers, advanced technology, elite operators, but they're all focused on defending against what they know. She turned to her companions, her expression serious. Tomorrow, they learn why competitive shooting at extreme range isn't just a sport. It's an art form that turns mathematics into precision, distance into advantage, and impossibility into inevitability. A distant rumble drew their attention, skyward. A sleek helicopter emerged from the gathering dusk, its black form cutting through the air with predatory grace. Becky tracked it through her spotting scope, noting details that most observers would miss. Russian Mi-17, heavily modified, she observed, reduced infrared signature, advanced avionics. They're establishing air superiority, probably equipped with thermal imaging systems and signal intelligence gear. 3 more choppers incoming from different directions, Ellie reported, checking her tablet. They're creating a coordinated air screen around the valley. Becky's expression remained calculating as she made new entries in her range book. More variables to consider. Rotor wash will affect wind patterns, change air density in their flight paths. Most shooters would see this as a complication. For us, she began plotting new calculations, it's just another element to factor into the equation. Her phone displayed an urgent update from Lancaster. The satellite feed showed vehicles departing from 5 different airports across 3 states, all converging on Blackfoot Valley. The director is mobilizing his entire network, Lancaster's message read. Facial recognition confirms multiple high-level organized crime figures among the arrivals. This isn't just about expanding territory. They're planning to establish a major operations hub. Thompson studied the data with growing concern. They're turning the processing plant into a command center, not just for local operations, but for their entire regional network. Because they think they've found the perfect location, Becky explained, bringing up topographical maps on her laptop. Remote enough to avoid attention, but with established transportation routes through the national forest, local law enforcement compromised, community resistance minimal. She gestured to the surrounding mountains, terrain that most people would consider a natural barrier to any serious opposition. Ellie spread out new intelligence gathered from the processing plant. They've installed a comprehensive security grid, motion sensors, infrared cameras, even acoustic detection systems designed to triangulate any gunshot within a 5-mile radius. Standard counter-sniper technology, Becky noted, making additional calculations, but they're calibrated for typical engagement ranges. At extreme distances, the acoustic signature of a shot changes completely. The bullet arrives before the sound of the shot. It creates a totally different pattern than their systems are designed to detect. She opened another specialized case, revealing what appeared to be ordinary brass cases. These aren't just shell casings. They're precision-engineered acoustic suppressors. In competition, we use them to reduce muzzle blast, minimize the effects of recoil. Out here, she held one up to the fading light, they'll make their shot detection systems useless beyond a certain range. Her phone chimed with another encrypted message. Lancaster had accessed the security contractor's technical specifications. The defensive measures being implemented around the processing plant represented the cutting edge of VIP protection. "Look at this," Becky indicated, showing them the technical readouts. They're deploying a mobile counter-sniper suite that costs more than most people's homes. Advanced ballistic computers, atmospheric sensors, even predictive AI designed to calculate probable shooting positions. Her smile held a predator's satisfaction, but all of it is based on military doctrine, on standard tactical assumptions. Thompson raised an eyebrow. And those assumptions don't apply to competitive shooting? Not at these ranges, Becky confirmed, entering new data into her ballistic calculator. Military sniping is about probability, putting rounds on target under combat conditions. Competitive shooting at extreme range, that's about eliminating variables, about turning chaos into mathematical certainty. She gestured to her range book, its pages filled with years of meticulous data. Every shot I've taken from these positions, under every possible weather condition, is documented here. Wind patterns, temperature variations, atmospheric pressure changes. It's not just data, it's a blueprint for making the impossible routine. Ellie's tablet displayed new security footage from inside the processing plant. Teams of contractors were installing additional protective measures, bulletproof panels, electronic countermeasures, even portable shield systems. They're preparing for every possible threat, she observed. Multiple redundant security layers, overlapping fields of fire, constant surveillance, and every single measure designed to counter threats they understand. Becky replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades pushing the boundaries of their craft. Look at their defensive positions, their patrol. In patterns, everything is based on the assumption that no one can effectively engage targets beyond certain distances. She brought up historical weather data, comparing it with current conditions. Tomorrow's forecast is perfect for extreme-range shooting, high-pressure system, stable air mass, minimal wind variance at altitude, conditions that most tactical operators wouldn't even consider relevant. Thompson watched as she made another series of precise calculations. You're not just planning to disrupt their operation, he realized. You're going to use their own security measures against them. Becky nodded, her expression focused. Every defensive position they establish, every patrol route they implement, they're not just showing us their playbook, they're limiting their own options. They think they're creating an impenetrable fortress. Instead, they're building a cage that will trap them in predictable patterns. Her phone displayed new thermal images from Lancaster. The processing plant was now surrounded by concentric rings of security, each layer adding another supposed level of protection. Remember the National Long-Range Championships 3 years ago? Becky asked, making final adjustments to her equipment. That shot they said was impossible, crosswind at 15 mph. Temperature gradient causing extreme mirage, target at 2,240 yards. Ellie's eyes widened. You won with a perfect score, because I understood something fundamental about extreme range shooting, Becky explained. At these distances, it's not about natural talent or even exceptional skill. It's about turning variables into constants, about understanding that every factor affecting the bullet's path can be measured, calculated, and compensated for. She began packing their observation equipment with practiced efficiency. Tomorrow, the director and his entire organization will learn a crucial lesson about the difference between tactical doctrine and pure precision. They're bringing in the best security money can buy, the latest technology, proven defensive protocols, but they're all designed to counter known threats, to defend against standard tactical approaches. Thompson helped secure their gear as Becky continued. In competition, we regularly make shots that military trainers consider theoretically impossible, not because we're better shooters, but because we approach it differently. Every variable is measured, every condition analyzed, every possible factor calculated into the equation. Her phone displayed one final update from Lancaster. The director's private jet had filed a flight plan for early morning arrival. They think they're preparing for a tactical engagement, Becky said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Instead, they're about to witness a demonstration of why competitive shooting at extreme range isn't just about hitting targets. It's about turning physics into poetry, mathematics into art, and impossibility into inevitable precision. First, light-painted Blackfoot Valley in shades of gold as a private Gulfstream jet touched down at the small regional airport. Becky watched through her spotting scope as a convoy of armored vehicles met the aircraft, their formation speaking of extensive protective training. The director had arrived, and with him came a level of security that transformed the quiet Montana morning into a tactical operation zone. 4 layers of protective detail, Thompson observed from their concealed position. Inner circle, outer. Security, advanced teams, and floating quick reaction force. Professional operators, not just hired muscle. They've got the airport locked down, Ellie added, monitoring radio frequencies with specialized equipment, private security contractors at every access point, air support maintaining constant coverage. Becky maintained her focus on the central vehicle, a heavily modified SUV with subtle armor upgrades that would stop anything short of specialized anti-material rounds. Through her scope, she caught a glimpse of the director, a slim man in an expensive suit, his movements carrying The confident precision of someone accustomed to absolute control. Motorcade moving, Ellie reported. Taking the mountain route to avoid population centers. They've got jammers active, disrupting all standard communications within half a mile of the convoy. Standard operating procedure for high-value target. Protection, Becky noted, already packing their observation gear. They'll take the long way, using terrain to their advantage, maintaining maximum tactical flexibility. Her phone displayed satellite imagery from Lancaster showing the convoys progress through the winding mountain roads. The director's security teams had established complete control of their route, with advance units securing potential ambush positions and aerial assets maintaining overwatch. They're good, Thompson admitted, watching the professional precision of the security operation. Every angle covered, every approach monitored. No one gets within a mile of that convoy without them knowing. Becky's smile held no warmth as she shouldered her rifle case. Fortunately, we don't need to get within a mile. She checked her watch. Time to move to alpha position. The real game begins at the processing plant. The mountain dawn had given way to clear morning skies as Becky and the Thompsons regrouped at their command center. Ellie's tablet displayed live feeds from discrete cameras they'd positioned around the valley, while Thompson coordinated with trusted allies from his law enforcement days, retired deputies and game wardens who could be counted on when the time came. We need more eyes on the ground, Becky said, studying the security deployment around the processing plant. People who won't attract attention, who can move freely without raising suspicion. I might be able to help with that, a new voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Marcus Martinez, owner of one of the largest ranches in the valley. His weathered face looked years older than when Becky had last seen him at the summer. County Fair. Frank called me, Martinez explained, nodding toward Thompson. Said you might need some assistance from folks who've been hurt by these criminals. Becky studied him carefully. This could get complicated, Marcus. Dangerous. They burned down my prize stallion stable after I refused to sell, Martinez replied, his voice hard. Insurance called it an accident, but my foreman found accelerant traces. Then 3 of my best breeding horses vanished. The sheriff didn't even bother taking a report. My family's worked this land for 4 generations. I'm not about to let some criminals run us off, Thompson vouched for him. Marcus served 2 tours with the Rangers before coming home to run the family ranch. He knows how to handle himself. Becky nodded, making a decision. We could use your help and maybe your connections. The auction tonight, they're requiring all major ranches to attend. We need eyes inside, people who can observe security patterns without drawing attention. Martinez smiled grimly. Already ahead of you. I've been talking with the Petersons, the Wilsons, the Black Hawks, all ranchers who've had accidents or livestock stolen after refusing to sell. They're ready to help. This isn't about vigilante justice, Becky cautioned. We're gathering intelligence, documenting criminal activity, building a case that federal authorities can't ignore. We understand, Martinez assured her. Nobody's looking for a shootout, but these folks have been watching their livelihoods threatened, their complaints ignored by local law enforcement. They want to take back their valley. Becky unfolded a map of the processing plant and surrounding area. Here's what we need. People positioned here, here, and here during the auction. They'll be looking for specific things: security rotations, communication patterns, personnel deployed in these areas. Martinez studied the map, his military training evident in how quickly he grasped the tactical situation. I can trust people at each location. What about communication? Nothing electronic, Becky replied. The director's team will be monitoring all frequencies, scanning for any unusual signals. Old-school methods only, observation, timed check-ins, pre-arranged signals, visible only to those who know what to look for. She pulled up the latest satellite imagery from Lancaster. Their security cordon extends approximately 1 mile from the processing plant in all directions. Inside that perimeter, they'll have complete electronic surveillance, motion sensors, infrared cameras. but they're focused on preventing infiltration, not on monitoring what's already inside. The ranchers attending the auction, Ellie realized. Exactly. They'll be subjected to security checks, of course, metal detectors, personal searches. But once inside, they'll be expected to move freely through the public areas. Martinez nodded in understanding. We can work with that. What specifically are we looking for? Becky pulled up blueprints of the facility. Based on their previous operations, they'll use the auction as cover for moving their actual cargo, weapon systems most likely, through these maintenance corridors. We need to document personnel movements, identify key figures, and if possible, obtain visual confirmation of what they're transporting. And the director, Thompson asked. He'll be heavily protected, constantly moving. He's actually the most predictable element, Becky replied. The director follows specific protocols developed during his military service. He'll conduct his business from a secure location with multiple barriers between him and any potential threat. Based on the facility layout, that's most likely the old manager's office on the upper level. It offers clear sightlines of the main auction floor while remaining defensible. Her phone displayed an update from Lancaster. Director's team has established complete perimeter control. Electronic countermeasures are active. Security conducting final sweeps of all approaches. Special concern noted about rooftop and elevated positions. They're thinking like urban operators, Becky observed. In a city, height advantages mean buildings, fixed, defensible positions. They don't understand that out here, the terrain itself provides hundreds of potential firing positions, most beyond the effective range of their detection equipment. Martinez considered this information. What's our timeline? The auction begins at 7 p.m., Ellie replied, checking her notes. Ranchers are required to arrive by 6:30 for security processing. Based on communications I've intercepted, they'll begin moving their actual cargo at approximately 8:15, when the high-value livestock bidding starts and all attention is focused on the main arena. And that's our window, Becky concluded. While everyone's attention is directed at the auction, we'll be documenting their real operation. Martinez nodded, standing to leave. I'll coordinate with the others, make sure everyone understands their roles. No heroics, just observation and documentation. After he departed, Thompson turned to Becky. You trust him? I trust his motivation, she replied. People defending their homes and livelihoods are the most reliable allies. But we need more than just eyes inside the auction. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. She turned to Ellie. Your access at the processing plant, how deep does it go? I can move throughout most of the administrative areas, Ellie replied. My official position gives me legitimate reasons to be in the main office, record rooms, even some of the security checkpoints. But since the director's advance team arrived, they've restricted access to certain areas, particularly the loading docks and the old cold storage facilities. Those restrictions tell us exactly where to focus, Becky said. The most heavily guarded areas are where they'll move their actual cargo. Can you access the security camera network? Ellie smiled for the first time that day. Already ahead of you, their system runs on a closed network, but it connects to the administrative computers for archiving purposes. I installed a passive monitoring program last week. It captures still images every 30 seconds from each camera and stores them on an encrypted drive. Excellent work, Becky said approvingly. That visual record will be crucial for building a case against them. What about personnel movements? The director won't handle anything directly. He'll use intermediaries, cutouts. I've been documenting visitors, noting which ones receive special treatment, Ellie replied, pulling up a file on her tablet. These 3 individuals arrived yesterday. They were escorted directly to secure areas, bypassing normal security protocols. Facial recognition matched them to known associates of European weapons trafficking networks. Becky studied the images. The director's buyers? They're here to inspect the merchandise before final delivery. She pointed to one man in particular. Anton Resnick, former Czech Special Forces, now one of the most active arms dealers in Eastern Europe. His presence confirms this isn't just about stolen livestock. Thompson looked troubled. If they're moving weapons of this caliber with buyers of this significance, the security will be unlike anything we've anticipated. On the contrary, Becky replied, it confirms exactly what I expected. High-value weapons transfers follow specific security protocols, predictable patterns established over decades of operations. The director doesn't improvise. He executes proven methods with meticulous precision. She pulled up a topographical map of the valley. Based on this intelligence, they'll move the cargo through these maintenance tunnels to the loading docks, then transfer to specialized transport vehicles, most likely disguised as ordinary livestock trailers. From there, they'll take the old forestry roads through national forest land, bypassing major highways and checkpoints. Ellie pointed to another section of the map. My access badge works for the administrative wing, which includes this corridor leading to the upper observation gallery. From there, I could potentially document the main cargo transfer without being detected. Becky considered this. Too risky. The director's team will have that area under constant surveillance. One unauthorized access attempt would compromise our entire operation. She shook her head. No, we need to maintain our distance advantage. The farther we are from their security perimeter, the more effectively we can operate. Her phone displayed another update from Lancaster, security implementing final measures. Counter-sniper teams deployed at all elevated positions within conventional tactical range. Electronic countermeasures active throughout the 1-mile perimeter. Director conducting personal inspection of security arrangements. They're creating what they believe is an impenetrable defense, Becky observed, and in doing so, they're revealing their blind spots. Look at their counter-sniper deployments, all focused on positions within standard engagement distances. They're not even considering the possibility of effective fire from beyond their security perimeter. Thompson studied satellite imagery. They've got the processing plant locked down tight, but they're ignoring the surrounding terrain. Because their entire security model is based on urban counter-sniper doctrine, Becky explained. In cities, effective shooting positions are limited, easily identified, and can be controlled. Out here, she gestured to the vast landscape visible through the window. The entire valley is a potential firing position. She turned to her specialized ballistic computer, inputting data from the weather stations they'd positioned throughout the valley. Today's conditions are nearly perfect. High barometric pressure, temperature gradient stabilizing, wind patterns predictable at altitude. Factors that most tactical security teams wouldn't even consider relevant. Ellie's communications monitor picked up encrypted transmissions from the processing plant. They're conducting final security briefings, she reported after running the signals through a decryption algorithm. Interesting. They're specifically warning about potential long-range threats, but listing maximum effective engagement distance at 1-200 yards. Becky smiled coldly. That's actually standard military doctrine. They're planning for the typical maximum effective range of military sniper systems. They don't understand that competitive shooting operates under completely different parameters. She turned to Thompson. We need to maintain observation of their security rotations. Their patrol patterns will establish predictable windows of opportunity. I'll coordinate with Martinez's people, Thompson replied. We can establish a rotation of observers using the ranch's legitimate activities as cover. Becky nodded, then turned to a case containing specialized communications equipment. We need to establish our command network. Nothing electronic within their security perimeter, but beyond that range, we can use these. She opened the case, revealing what appeared to be ordinary hunting radios. These operate on frequencies that their electronic warfare suite won't be. Monitoring. Bands typically used for wildlife tracking and forestry operations. Short range, low power, but sufficient for our needs. Thompson examined the equipment. Will they work with all the jamming they're doing? They won't try to jam these frequencies. Doing so would interfere with legitimate regional communications and draw unwanted attention. More importantly, these transmit in short encrypted bursts, virtually indistinguishable from background noise, unless you know exactly what to listen for. Ellie's tablet alerted her to a new development. Incoming message from Marcus, the sheriff's. Department is setting up roadblocks on all approaches to the processing plant. They're checking IDs, turning away anyone who's not on the approved list for tonight's auction. Another layer of security, but also another opportunity, Becky observed. They're so focused on controlling access that they're creating predictable patterns. Each security measure they implement actually gives us more information about their operations, their priorities. Her phone displayed new thermal imagery from Lancaster. The processing plant was now surrounded by concentric rings of security, each layer adding another supposed level of protection. Look at the heat signatures, Becky pointed out. They've positioned their counter-sniper teams here, here, and here, all elevated positions with good sight lines to the surrounding area, but they're all within 800 yards of the facility. Standard tactical positioning, but completely inadequate for detecting or countering threats from extreme range. Thompson studied thermal images. They've got a lot of personnel deployed along the access roads, but minimal coverage on the northern approach. Because the northern ridge is considered too distant for effective engagement, Becky explained. Most security specialists consider shots beyond 1,200 yards to be technically possible, but practically unreliable. Too many variables, too many potential errors. She pulled up her custom ballistic calculator. But when you've spent decades quantifying those variables, documenting those conditions, what they consider impossibly complex becomes mathematically predictable. Ellie's system pinged with an alert. Motion sensors detecting vehicle movement on the old forestry road. Looks like they're bringing in additional equipment. The satellite feed confirmed her observation. A convoy of trucks was approaching the processing plant from the east, taking the rarely used logging roads to avoid attention. Let's see what they're delivering, Becky said, adjusting her spotting scope to focus on the approaching vehicles. The convoy consisted of 4 heavy trucks with specialized cargo containers, the kind designed for transporting sensitive electronic equipment. As they approached the processing plant's rear entrance, teams of security personnel created a protective cordon, screening the vehicles from observation. Those are military-grade electronic warfare systems, Becky observed, recognizing the distinctive shapes being unloaded. Advanced signal intelligence platforms, counter-surveillance equipment. They're establishing a complete electronic umbrella over the facility. Does that change our approach? Thompson asked. Not at all, Becky replied with quiet confidence. In fact, it confirms we're on the right track. They're committing significant resources to electronic security because that's what they understand, what their doctrine emphasizes. They're preparing to counter a high-tech threat, surveillance drones, electronic eavesdropping, signals intelligence. She returned to her planning table. Meanwhile, we'll be operating on principles that predate electronics, mathematics, physics, and precision marksmanship, the same fundamentals that have governed long-range shooting since the first competitive matches in the 1870s. Ellie looked thoughtful. It's almost like they're fighting the last war, preparing for threats they've encountered before, while you're operating on a completely different paradigm. Exactly, Becky confirmed. Military and security doctrine evolves based on experience, on countering known threats. The director's security teams are executing proven protocols that have kept him safe for decades. But they've never encountered someone who approaches long-range shooting as a pure mathematical challenge. Her phone displayed another update from Lancaster. Director conducting final security briefing. Particular emphasis on eliminating potential observation positions. aerial assets deployed with thermal imaging systems. They're searching for observers, Thompson noted, and they won't find any because we're not where they're looking, Becky replied. Their thermal systems are designed to detect human heat signatures at tactical ranges, generally within 2 miles. Beyond that distance, atmospheric interference and thermal blooming render such systems increasingly ineffective. She returned to her ballistic calculations. The same atmospheric conditions that degrade their detection systems are precisely the variables we measure and compensate for in competitive shooting. What they see as limitations, we see as data points. Martinez's truck appeared on the ridgeline, approaching their position with deliberate care to avoid drawing attention. As he entered their command center, his expression was grim but determined. "I've coordinated with the others," he reported. 12 ranchers, all with legitimate reasons to attend the auction, will be positioned throughout the facility. Each has been briefed on what to observe, what to document. He unfolded a hand-drawn map on the table. Peterson will be near the main entrance, tracking security rotations. Wilson and his son will position themselves by the east corridor, which leads to the loading docks. The Blackhawk sisters will use their veterinary credentials to access the livestock holding areas, giving them sight lines to the rear maintenance bays. Becky studied the deployment with approval. Perfect coverage of all key areas. What about communications? "As you suggested, nothing electronic," Martinez confirmed. "We're using pre-arranged signals, specific gestures, items placed in particular, positions, actions that would appear natural to observers but carry meaning to those who know what to look for." He pointed to specific areas on the map. If they observe unusual activity in any of these zones, they'll signal using these methods. Additionally, each has memorized a section of the facility layout and will be able to provide detailed observations. Afterward, Thompson nodded in approval. "Good work, Marcus. This network gives us eyes throughout the facility without triggering their surveillance systems." "There's something else," Martinez added, his expression darkening. "Word around town is that several farms have reported break-ins over the past 24 hours. Nothing stolen, but signs of intrusion. Property searched, equipment examined." Becky's expression hardened. "They're looking for me, trying to identify potential threats before the director's main operation tonight." She turned to Thompson. "Frank, they'll eventually track me to my farm. We need to prepare for that contingency. I've already stationed some of my trusted former deputies near your property," Thompson assured her. "At the first sign of posse activity, they'll alert us." "That's not what I meant," Becky replied, her voice taking on a new edge. "If Reynolds and his people go to my farm, I want them to find exactly what I've prepared for them." Ellie looked concerned. "You're using your home as bait." "More like a message," Becky explained. "The director needs to understand he's not dealing with an ordinary opponent. Sometimes in tactical operations, you need to shape your adversary's perception, guide their response." Her phone chimed with an alert from one of the motion sensors they'd placed along the approach to her property. The screen showed 3 vehicles, Reynolds' truck leading 2 others, turning onto the long drive to her farmhouse. Becky smiled coldly. "Right on schedule. Now we'll see if they take the bait." Thompson looked alarmed. "Shouldn't we do something?" "We are doing something," Becky replied, her voice steady. "We're allowing them to focus on the wrong target while we prepare our actual operation. Every minute they spend searching my farm is a minute they're not strengthening their security at the processing plant." The satellite feed showed the vehicles approaching Becky's farmhouse, spreading out to surround the property in what they clearly thought was a tactical formation. "Watch how they deploy," Becky instructed, pointing to the screen. "Standard, rural. Property search pattern. Secure the perimeter, approach from multiple angles, maintain overlapping fields of fire. Textbook execution for a basic tactical team." The feed showed armed men emerging from the vehicles, moving toward the house with weapons drawn. Reynolds directed the operation from the center position, clearly visible as he gestured toward different areas of the property. "They're making a fundamental error," Becky observed. "Concentrating their forces, creating a tight perimeter. In urban operations, that's sound doctrine. Control the immediate environment, prevent escape. Out here, it makes them vulnerable." The men entered her house, while others began searching the barn and outbuildings. For several minutes, they conducted a thorough search of the property. "What are they looking for?" Ellie asked. "Evidence, intelligence, anything that might tell them who they're dealing with," Becky replied. "And they'll find exactly what I want them to find." On screen, the search team emerged from the house. Reynolds was holding something, a framed certificate that had been hanging in Becky's study. Even from the satellite feed, his body language showed clear agitation as he examined the document. "What did you leave for them?" Thompson asked. Becky's smile was cold. "My Army marksmanship instructor certification, complete with specialization in extreme long-range shooting, plus a few competition trophies and range cards for this valley. Enough to make them understand exactly what kind of opponent they're facing." The feed showed Reynolds making a phone call, his posture indicating urgent communication. The other team members had changed their tactical stance, now scanning the distant ridgelines with much more concern. "And now they'll report to the director," Becky observed with satisfaction. "They'll tell him he's facing a trained military sniper with competition experience. That will trigger specific security protocols, reinforcing close protection details, securing indoor locations, limiting exposure in open areas." "You're manipulating their response," Martinez realized. "Precisely. They'll implement their standard anti-sniper protocols, focusing on conventional tactical ranges and approaches. Meanwhile, we'll be operating beyond their security perimeter, at distances their doctrine says are effectively impossible." As they watched, Reynolds made a gesture to his team. The men began retreating to their vehicles, but now they moved differently, staying low, minimizing exposure, scanning the surroundings with much greater intensity. "They're running scared," Thompson observed. "Not scared enough," Becky replied, "but they're starting to understand they're not dealing with an ordinary opponent. That uncertainty will affect their decision-making, creating hesitation in their responses." She returned to her planning table. "Now we finalize our preparations. Tonight, the director learns the difference between tactical doctrine and mathematical precision." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as Becky made her final preparations. Through her spotting scope, she observed increased activity at the processing plant. Security teams conducting last-minute sweeps, specialized equipment being deployed, and civilian vehicles beginning to arrive for the evening's auction. "They've doubled the guards at all entrances," Thompson reported, monitoring the security feeds from their hidden cameras. "Full weapons checks, ID verification, even bringing in dogs to sweep the incoming vehicles." "Standard procedure," Becky replied, making notations in her range book. "But look at their deployment pattern. They're concentrating their assets around the facility perimeter and main structure. Minimal coverage of the surrounding landscape beyond 1,000 yards. Her phone displayed an encrypted message from Lancaster. "Satellite confirms director on-site. Security implementing maximum protection protocols. Electronic countermeasures active. Throughout the target area, facial recognition has identified multiple known arms dealers among arriving guests." "Ranchers are starting to arrive," Ellie noted, checking her watch. "Marcus and his people should be moving into position now." Becky nodded, her expression focused as she studied the deployment of security forces around the processing plant. "It's time for our first move. We need to shape the battlefield, influence their security patterns without revealing our actual intentions." She turned to Thompson. "Frank, get your trusted deputies in position along the northern access road. Have them establish a visible observation post. Nothing threatening, just clearly monitoring the processing plant from outside their security perimeter." Thompson looked confused. "Won't that just alert them to our presence?" Exactly, Becky confirmed with a cold smile. Security protocols are predictable. When they detect surveillance, they'll deploy counter-surveillance teams to that sector. That will draw resources away from the areas we're actually interested in. She turned to a map of the facility. Meanwhile, I need to verify some key measurements. There's a ridge west of the processing plant, beyond their security perimeter, but with clear sightlines to the loading docks. I need to confirm exact distances, atmospheric conditions, and potential interference factors. That ridge is over 200 yards from the target, Thompson observed, well beyond effective range for conventional shooting. For conventional shooting, yes, Becky agreed, but this isn't about conventional approaches. This is about turning mathematical principles into tactical advantage. She selected specialized equipment from her gear, a laser rangefinder with atmospheric sensors, a portable weather station, and her handcrafted ammunition. I'll need about 2 hours for a complete site assessment. During that time, I need you to coordinate with Marcus and begin implementing our distraction protocols. What about me? Ellie asked. I need you monitoring their communications, Becky replied. As their security teams respond to our diversions, their command structure will reveal key information, reaction times, deployment patterns, priority, zones. That intelligence will be crucial for timing our main operation. She checked her watch. The auction begins in 4 hours. By then, we need to have their security forces responding to multiple perceived threats, none of which represent our actual approach. Thompson nodded in understanding. Deception operations. Keep them looking in all the wrong directions. Precisely, Becky confirmed. In tactical operations, perception management is often more important than actual force deployment. We need them believing they're countering a conventional threat while we prepare something entirely different. She shouldered her equipment bag and moved toward the door. I'll be in total silence while at the observation post. If anything critical develops, use the emergency signal only. The western ridge offered a commanding view of the processing plant and surrounding area. Becky established her position with practiced efficiency, using natural features for concealment while setting up her specialized measurement equipment. Through her spotting scope, she could see the entire facility. Security. Teams moving with practiced precision. Arriving ranchers being processed through checkpoints. And the director's personal security detail establishing multiple defensive layers around the main building. For the next hour, she methodically documented every relevant factor that would affect long-range shooting. Wind speeds at various elevations, temperature gradients across the valley, atmospheric pressure readings, and precise distances to key points throughout the facility. Each measurement was recorded in her range book with meticulous attention to detail. Her portable weather station gathered data on microclimate conditions specific to this firing position. In competition shooting, these minute variations could make the difference between a perfect shot and a complete miss at extreme distances. Most military snipers worked with standardized ballistic tables. Competitive shooters like Becky created custom calculations for each specific location and condition. As she worked, her spotting scope picked up new movement at the processing plant's perimeter. A security team deploying toward the northern access road, exactly where Thompson had positioned his deputies as a diversion. Their predictable response confirmed what she had anticipated. The director's security forces were following standard counter-surveillance protocols, allocating resources based on perceived threats. Her phone vibrated with an update from Ellie. Security teams responding to the northern observation post. Communications indicate heightened alert status. Deploying counter-surveillance teams to multiple sectors. Perfect. Their first deception was working as planned. Becky continued her measurements, noting how the afternoon sun created distinct temperature layers in the air column between her position and the target area. These thermal gradients would affect bullet trajectory in ways that most tactical shooters never considered, creating both challenges and opportunities for someone with her specialized knowledge. She opened her ammunition case, selecting specific rounds crafted for these exact conditions. Each cartridge represented hours of meticulous work, cases measured to precise tolerances, powder charges weighed to 1/10 of a grain, bullets selected for perfect balance and aerodynamic stability. In competition, this level of preparation was standard practice for elite shooters pushing the boundaries of long-range accuracy. Her phone vibrated again. Second security team deployed to western perimeter. Aerial surveillance was redirected to scan ridgelines within 1,500 yards of the facility. Becky smiled coldly. They were expanding their security perimeter, but still focusing on conventional tactical distances. Her current position, at over 2,200 yards, remained well outside their area of concern. She continued documenting critical measurements, creating a comprehensive firing solution that accounted for every variable affecting bullet trajectory at this extreme distance. The director's security team had established what they considered complete coverage of all potential threat vectors, but they were operating under a fundamental misconception about the practical limits of long-range shooting. After completing her measurements, Becky carefully packed her equipment and withdrew from the position, leaving no trace of her presence. As she made her way back through the wooded terrain, she noted increased aerial activity, helicopters conducting sweeps of the surrounding area, focusing on the distances that conventional military doctrine considered the maximum effective range. For sniper operations, upon returning to their command center, she found Thompson and Ellie monitoring the security response to their diversionary tactics. They've deployed nearly 30% of their perimeter security to counter our observation posts, Thompson reported with satisfaction, exactly as you predicted. And they've diverted aerial assets to conduct ridge sweeps within 1,500 yards. Ellie added, monitoring the security communications. They're looking exactly where you want them to look. More importantly, they're not looking where they should be, Becky noted, unfolding her range book to reveal the comprehensive firing solutions she'd developed. I've confirmed measurements to all key targets. The conditions are nearly perfect. High pressure system, stable air mass, predictable wind patterns at altitude. She pulled up the processing plant schematics on their main display. Based on their security deployments, the director will be operating from this office complex on the upper level. It provides optimal security while maintaining visual oversight of the main auction floor. Thompson studied the location. That's deep inside the facility, surrounded by multiple security layers. Which is precisely why it follows his established pattern, Becky explained. The director always positions himself with at least 3 defensive barriers between him and any potential threat. It's a security protocol he's followed for decades. She indicated specific areas on the schematic. More importantly, look at the pattern of their security deployments. They've established concentric defensive rings, each designed to detect and neutralize threats at specific distances, but all of these defenses are calibrated for conventional tactical approaches. Ellie's communications monitoring system picked up encrypted transmissions from the processing plant. After running them through a decryption algorithm, she reported, they're implementing the final security protocol, codename Diamond Barrier. Sounds like they're establishing some kind of specialized defensive screen around the main facility. Diamond Barrier is a multi-spectrum security protocol, Becky explained, recognizing the terminology from her military days. It combines physical security, electronic countermeasures, and specialized sensors designed to detect any approach within the operational perimeter. Very effective against conventional threats, but like all their systems, it's designed for standard tactical scenarios. Her phone displayed new thermal imagery from Lancaster. The processing plant was now surrounded by what security professionals would consider an impenetrable defensive screen. Multiple layers of protection, each adding another level of security. Auctions started in 90 minutes, Thompson noted, checking his watch. Marcus and his team should be moving through security now. As if on cue, Ellie's secure communicator received a pre-arranged signal from Martinez, a specifically worded text about livestock pricing that actually confirmed. He and his team had successfully passed through security and were establishing their observation positions throughout the facility. "They're in," Ellie confirmed. "All 12 ranches have passed security checks and are deploying as planned." Becky nodded in satisfaction. "Now we wait for their intelligence. Once the auction begins, the director's real operation will commence, moving their actual cargo, while all attention is focused on the public event." She turned to her specialized equipment, making final preparations for the operation to come. Each item was checked with methodical precision, the habits of someone who understood that at extreme distances, the smallest detail could make the difference between success and failure. "There's something I don't understand," Ellie said, watching. "Becky, work. If your goal is to document their operation for federal authorities, why all focus on shooting positions and firing solutions?" Becky paused, her expression turning serious. "Because documentation alone isn't enough. I've seen how the director operates. He maintains plausible deniability, keeps himself insulated from direct connection to criminal activities. Even with comprehensive evidence of the weapons trafficking operation, he would likely escape prosecution." "So, what's your actual plan?" Thompson asked, his law enforcement experience making him sensitive to the unspoken implications. "To create a situation where the director has no choice but to reveal his operation," Becky explained. "By systematically dismantling his security protocols, eliminating his escape options, and controlling his movement patterns, we can force him into a position where federal authorities can apprehend him with direct evidence of his involvement." She turned back to her equipment. "This isn't about taking a shot. It's about using precision shooting to manipulate a tactical scenario, creating specific effects at key moments that will shape the battlefield to our advantage." The satellite feed showed increased activity at the processing plant as the time for the auction approached. Ranchers' vehicles were lined up at the security checkpoints, while the director's security teams maintained vigilant watch over the entire operation. Martinez's first intelligence update came through, a seemingly innocent text about cattle prices that actually contained coded information about security deployments inside the facility. Ellie quickly decoded the message. "They've established additional security checkpoints inside the main corridor," she reported. "Anyone approaching the administrative wing or loading docks is subjected to secondary screening. The director's personal security detail has established a buffer zone around the upper-level office complex." "As expected," Becky noted. "What about the cargo movement?" Ellie decoded the next section of Martinez's message. He's observed specialized transport containers being moved through the maintenance corridor, heavily guarded, sensors monitoring atmospheric conditions around the containers. "Definitely not livestock. Temperature-controlled weapon components," Becky concluded. "Likely advanced guidance systems or electronic warfare modules, the kind of technology that would require specialized handling during transport." Her phone displayed another update from Lancaster. "Federal task force on standby, awaiting confirmation of weapons trafficking before intervention. Need definitive evidence linking the director to illicit cargo." "And that's our primary objective," Becky said, reading the message. "We need to create a situation where the director is directly connected to the illegal weapons, with no possibility of denial or evasion." Thompson looked concerned. "These people are professionals with military-grade security and years of experience. How do you plan to force their hand?" Becky's smile was cold but confident. By applying principles they don't understand at distances they consider impossible. By turning mathematical precision into tactical advantage. She unfolded a detailed, operational timeline. Here's how it will unfold. First, we create a series of disruptions to their security systems. Not enough to trigger a full lockdown, but sufficient to create uncertainty and force them to adapt their protocols. She pointed to specific times on the schedule. At these points, strategically placed shots will disable key equipment, communications relays, vehicle transport systems, electronic security measures. Not dramatic enough to evacuate the facility, but precise enough to disrupt their operation. "And the director?" Ellie asked. "Will respond according to his established patterns," Becky explained. "When security is compromised, he follows a specific protocol, relocating to a secondary position, then to a pre-established extraction point if the situation continues to deteriorate. By controlling which systems fail and in what sequence, we can influence his movement decisions." She indicated a specific area on the facility schematic. "Our objective is to maneuver him into this loading dock area at precisely 9:15 p.m., when Martinez's intelligence indicates the weapons shipment will be prepared for transport. With the director physically present during the transfer, federal authorities will have the direct connection they need to justify intervention." Thompson studied the plan with professional appreciation. "It's like a chess game, anticipating his responses, forcing specific moves." "Exactly," Becky confirmed. "In both competitive shooting and tactical operations, success comes from the same fundamental approach: eliminating variables, controlling the environment, and executing with mathematical precision." Her phone vibrated with another update from Lancaster. "Satellite confirms high-value vehicles moving into position at extraction points around the facility. Director implementing standard security rotation, primary team active now, secondary team preparing for shift change at 2100 hours. "That's our window," Becky noted. "During security transitions, there's always a brief period of vulnerability as teams exchange information and responsibilities. We'll initiate our first disruption precisely at shift change." She checked her watch. "The auction begins in 45 minutes. Once it's underway, the director's actual operation will commence. That's when we begin shaping the battlefield." As dusk approached, the processing plant transformed into a hive of activity. Ranchers' vehicles filled the parking areas, security teams maintained vigilant watch over all approaches, and inside the facility, the final preparations for the auction were underway. Ellie's monitoring system detected a sudden spike in communications from the processing plant. "Something's happening," she reported, quickly analyzing the data. "Increased security communications, multiple teams responding to something at the north perimeter." The satellite feed showed security personnel converging on the northern boundary of the facility, where one of Thompson's diversionary observation posts had been established. "They've engaged with our decoy position," Becky observed. "Exactly as planned. That will draw attention and resources away from other areas." Thompson looked concerned. "My people know to withdraw rather than escalate, right?" "They've been thoroughly briefed," Becky assured him. "This is about creating the perception of a threat, not an actual confrontation." The security response unfolded exactly as she had anticipated. Multiple teams deployed to investigate the observation post, creating temporary gaps in their perimeter coverage. Meanwhile, the auction proceedings began on schedule, with ranchers gathering in the main arena as the first livestock was presented for bidding. Martinez's next update came through, again disguised as an innocent message about cattle pricing. "Special cargo moving through Eastern Corridor. Director personally inspecting shipment. Secondary security teams establish isolation zone around the handling area. The director is directly involving himself with the weapons shipment, Becky noted, with satisfaction. That's unusual. He typically maintains distance from the actual contraband. Something about this cargo is significant enough to warrant his personal attention. Her phone displayed new thermal imagery from Lancaster. The processing plant's eastern wing showed distinct heat signatures consistent with electronic equipment, and power systems, significantly higher thermal output than would be expected for livestock processing. Look at those heat patterns, Becky indicated. Consistent with advanced weapon systems, likely guidance components or specialized electronic warfare modules. The thermal signature matches patterns I've seen in military weapons development. Facilities. She turned to her operational timeline. We're moving to Phase 1. The auction is underway, their security is focused on conventional threats, and we've confirmed the presence of illegal weapons. Now we begin systematically altering their tactical environment. Becky activated their secure communication system, connecting with their network of observers positioned around the facility. All units implement Protocol Sierra. I repeat, implement Protocol Sierra. Throughout the valley, Thompson's trusted deputies began executing their assigned tasks, creating minor security incidents at carefully selected locations around the processing plant's extended perimeter. Nothing threatening enough to trigger a lockdown, but sufficient to draw security resources away from the facility's core areas. The response was immediate and predictable. Security teams deployed to investigate each disturbance, following standard protocols for perimeter defense. As they had anticipated, this created temporary gaps in the security coverage, brief windows of opportunity that would be invisible to conventional observers, but critical to their operation. Security forces responded exactly as expected, Ellie reported, monitoring the communications. They're treating these as routine perimeter violations, not a coordinated threat, because their doctrine emphasizes immediate response to all potential security breaches, Becky explained. They're following established procedures without recognizing the pattern. She checked her watch. Time for Phase 2. The security shift. Change begins in 15 minutes. That's our window to implement the first major disruption. Becky turned to her specialized equipment, making final adjustments to her ballistic calculations. The mathematical formulas filled pages of her range book. Wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric effects, even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. At extreme distances, these calculations weren't just helpful, they were essential for precision shooting. Target identified, she announced, studying the facility through her specialized optics. Primary communications array on the northwestern tower, range 2,240 yards. Wind 4.5 panifage quartering from the southwest. Temperature gradient stable. Barometric pressure 30.2 and rising. She made minute adjustments to her calculations, accounting for variables that most tactical shooters would never even consider. Flight time is approximately 3.1 seconds. Bullet drop approximately 38.5 feet. Wind drift approximately 17 inches. Thompson watched in fascination as she transformed these complex variables into a precise firing solution. This wasn't just shooting. It was applied mathematics at its most demanding. The security shift change begins in exactly 7 minutes, Ellie reported, monitoring the facility's communications. Primary and secondary teams will conduct their handover at the command center, temporarily reducing coverage of outlying areas. Perfect. Timing, Becky confirmed, finalizing her calculations. When their communications array fails at precisely that moment, it will create maximum confusion during the transition period. She checked her range card one final time, verifying each measurement with meticulous precision. In competitive shooting, this level of attention to detail was standard practice for elite competitors. In tactical operations, it was the difference. Between success and failure, Martinez reports all observation teams in position, Ellie announced. They're documenting the weapons transfer operation in the Eastern Wing. The director is personally overseeing the inventory process. Ideal scenario, Becky noted with cold satisfaction. When the disruptions begin, he'll follow his established security protocols, moving first to his secondary command post, then to the extraction point if the situation continues to deteriorate. She checked her watch again. Initiating phase. 2 in 3 minutes. This is where we begin actively shaping their tactical environment. As the sun dipped below the western mountains, casting long shadows across Blackfoot Valley, Becky Callahan prepared to demonstrate why competitive shooting at extreme range wasn't just a sport. It was a specialized skill that could transform. A tactical operation in ways conventional security doctrine never anticipated. Security shift change commencing, Ellie reported, monitoring the encrypted communications, primary and secondary teams converging on the command center for handover briefing. Becky nodded, her expression focused as she made final adjustments. To her firing position. Phase 2 initiates in 30 seconds. Stand by for the first precision effect. The first shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, a whisper of sound as the custom round left the barrel, beginning its 3.1-second journey across more than a mile of Montana air. The mathematical calculations had translated into a flight path of extraordinary precision, guided by decades of competitive shooting experience. Exactly 3.1 seconds later, the processing plant's primary communications array failed. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but with surgical precision that disabled key components while leaving others intact. The effect was exactly what Becky had intended: confusion rather than alarm, disruption rather than destruction. Communications array disabled, Ellie confirmed, monitoring the facility's reaction. Security teams implementing contingency protocols, switching to backup systems. And now, Becky said with quiet certainty, we begin actively controlling the battlefield. 3 weeks after the operation at the Morrisville processing plant, Becky Callahan stood on the charred remains of her front porch, surveying the destruction. The farmhouse that had been her home, her sanctuary with Daniel, was now little more than a blackened skeleton against the Montana sky. The Blackfoot posse's revenge had been swift and brutal. While Becky and her allies had been executing their operation at the processing plant, Reynolds and his men had descended on her farm with gasoline and hatred, destroying everything they could touch. They didn't find the root cellar, Thompson said, joining her amid the devastation. Your competition trophies, Daniel's photos, they're all safe, just like you planned. Becky nodded, kneeling to sift some of the ash through her fingers. This was always a possibility. The director's organization doesn't tolerate failure. The night at the processing plant had unfolded with mathematical precision. Each strategically placed shot had systematically dismantled the director's security protocols, eliminating his escape options one by one. When federal agents had finally moved in, they'd found the director standing amid crates of advanced weapons components, his direct involvement irrefutable. They've indicted Commissioner Roberts and half the sheriff's department, Thompson continued. The federal investigation has expanded to 3 states. They're calling it one of the largest weapons trafficking operations uncovered in the past decade. And the director, Becky asked. No bail. The judge cited his international connections and flight risk. The prosecutor is talking about a minimum 20-year sentence. The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. A convoy of trucks and SUVs made their way up the long drive, dust billowing behind them. Marcus Martinez stepped out of the lead truck, followed by a dozen other ranchers from throughout the valley. Each vehicle was loaded with building materials, tools, and supplies. Hope you don't mind, Martinez said, approaching Becky with a rolled set of blueprints. But we figured it was time Blackfoot Valley repaid its debt. You saved our lands, our livelihoods. Seemed only right. We helped rebuild yours." He unfolded the blueprints, revealing plans for a new farmhouse, similar to the original in spirit but improved in practical ways. "Peterson's son is an architect. Designed this specifically with your needs in mind. Better sight lines, reinforced construction, even a proper workshop for your competition equipment." "This isn't charity," Martinez insisted when Becky tried to object. "It's a community. What happens to one of us happens to all of us. That's what the posse and the director never understood about places like Blackfoot Valley." The ranchers had already begun unloading equipment, setting up work areas, with the efficient organization of people accustomed to hard labor. Families were establishing a temporary kitchen, children were clearing debris, and within minutes the charred remains of Becky's farm had transformed into a bustling construction site. Becky watched in amazement as her neighbors, many of whom she barely knew, worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed. In all her tactical preparations, all her mathematical precision, she had never anticipated this outpouring of community support. A week into the reconstruction, as the new frame stood complete against the Montana sky, Maverick's ears perked up. At a distant sound, Becky immediately registered the German Shepherd's alert posture. "Northern approach road," she said quietly to Thompson. "3 vehicles, moving slowly, engines throttled down to reduce noise." "Reynolds?" "Almost certainly. Get the civilians clear." Through her spotting scope, she identified Reynolds' truck, leading 2 others. Gun racks visible in each vehicle, multiple armed figures inside. This wasn't a casual visit, it was an assault force intent on finishing what they'd started with. The burning of her farm. But unlike their previous attack, this one was unfolding exactly as Becky had anticipated. The motion sensors had tracked their approach from the moment they crossed back into Montana. More importantly, they were now entering terrain that Becky had spent years documenting. As Reynolds and his team approached the final ridge before Becky's property, they positioned their vehicles in what they clearly believed was a concealed location, dismounting with weapons ready. The posse members spread out, establishing what they thought were overlapping fields of fire. Becky's phone displayed satellite imagery from Lancaster, high-resolution thermal imaging showing the heat signatures of Reynolds and his team as they moved into position. Federal response team alerted, ETA 15 minutes. Recommend non-engagement if possible. The first shot came from Reynolds' position, a loud crack that echoed across the valley as a bullet struck the framework of the new house. But there was no panic, no confusion, no fleeing civilians. Only the methodical documentation of their assault from multiple camera angles, and the calm voice of Frank Thompson on a loudspeaker. "Jackson Reynolds, this is former Sheriff Frank T.H." The posse members froze momentarily, clearly not expecting this organized response. Reynolds recovered first, shouting commands to his team to maintain positions. "They're bluffing. There's no law enforcement here. Commissioner Roberts would have warned us." Instead of backing down, the posse opened fire on the construction site, multiple weapons discharging in an intimidating display of firepower. Becky moved with calm purpose to a specialized case. From it, she removed not a sniper rifle as Thompson might have expected, but what appeared to be a modified target pistol. "Competitive shooters call it a wax bullet gun," Becky explained. "Fires a low-velocity projectile. No lethal potential, but remarkable accuracy at moderate ranges." Her first shot, when it came, was almost inaudible compared to the posse's continued gunfire. The specialized projectile traveled with remarkable precision to strike the lead truck's radiator. Before Reynolds or his team could register what had happened, Becky fired twice more, each shot striking critical engine components on the remaining vehicles. "Vehicles disabled," Becky reported calmly. "They're contained until federal authorities arrive." 5 minutes later, the federal response became unmistakable. Helicopters appeared over the ridge, their distinctive black profiles cutting through the Montana sky. Ground vehicles approached from multiple directions, creating a complete containment perimeter around Reynolds and his increasingly desperate team. The standoff ended not with dramatic gunfire, but with the quiet inevitability of overwhelming force professionally applied. Faced with federal agents, helicopter support, and the complete neutralization of their escape options, the posse members surrendered one by one. Lancaster himself approached Becky's observation post. A tall, serious man whose government credentials identified him only as a special advisor to a federal task force. Precision work, he observed. Non-lethal interdiction while maintaining complete documentation of hostile intent. Textbook execution. Just applied mathematics, Becky replied, modestly, calculating the minimum necessary effect to achieve the desired outcome. The director's operation has been completely dismantled. 7 countries, 48 arrests, weapons shipments intercepted across 3 continents. Your work here was the linchpin that made it possible. He glanced toward the partially constructed farmhouse. The offer still stands, you know. Your skills are still needed. I appreciate the offer, she replied, her decision already made. But I think my skills are needed right here. 2 months later, as autumn painted Blackfoot Valley in vibrant hues of gold and crimson, Becky Callahan stood on the front porch of her newly completed farmhouse. Thompson and Ellie arrived for the small housewarming gathering Becky had finally agreed to host. Still, can't believe you let them talk you into a party, Thompson remarked. The Becky Callahan I first met would have considered this an operational security risk, she smiled. People change, priorities shift. Ellie handed Becky a newspaper announcing the formal indictment of Commissioner Roberts and 14 members of the local sheriff's department. The county's holding special elections next month. Some folks have even suggested you run for something. Becky laughed. I think I'll stick to competitive shooting and farming. More vehicles appeared on the horizon. Martinez and his family, the Petersons, the Wilsons, all coming to celebrate not just a rebuilt home, but a reclaimed community. You know what I realized during all of this? She said quietly to Thompson. In the military, in competitive shooting, I always focused on precision as an individual skill. But what happened here in Blackfoot Valley was a different kind of precision, the coordinated effort of an entire community working toward a common purpose. She gestured toward the approaching neighbors. That's something the director and Reynolds never understood. They saw strength only in weapons, in intimidation, in control. They never grasped that true security comes from belonging, from people who stand together when threatened. Later that evening, Becky stepped out onto the porch, alone, gazing up at the stars that had once served as reference points for her ballistic calculations. Daniel would have appreciated the irony, that his quiet, reserved wife had found her true purpose not in competition or military service, but in defending a community that had become her own. In the distance, the mountains of Blackfoot Valley stood silhouetted against the night sky, the same ridgelines that had provided firing positions during the operation against the director. Those elevations had once represented tactical advantage. Now they simply marked the boundaries of home. The Outlaws had destroyed her farmhouse, ignorant of her sharpshooting past, but in doing so, they had inadvertently helped create something far stronger. A defender who had found her true home, and a community that stood together against those who would threaten it. Mathematics and precision marksmanship had won the immediate battle, but it was belonging to this place, these people, that had ultimately won the war. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.